Climate discussions are at a moment of transition, with some countries increasingly wanting to focus on fossil fuels and less on emissions, while others remain more resistant to this change. I'm Camila Fontana, Deputy Bureau Chief of Argus in Brazil, and today I'm talking with Lucas Parolin, our news editor. Welcome back, Lucas.
Hi, Camila. Great to be back.
Shall we go straight to the point? Tell us a bit more about this clash between fossil fuels and emissions.
Camila, the whole world has been trying to solve the problem of global warming since the 1990s. First came Rio 92, which not only consolidated the concept that it's possible to grow economically without destroying the environment, but also laid out the foundation for future COPs, the UN climate change conferences, etc., etc. Then we had important agreements, such as the Kyoto Protocol in 97 and the Paris Agreement in 2015. And all of these pointed to carbon emissions as the big villain of global warming. And of course, the premise isn't wrong. Science is very clear in showing the relationship between rising emissions and rising global temperatures. But science is also very clear in saying that the main cause of rising emissions is the production and consumption of fossil fuels. Scientists point out that fossil fuels are responsible for between 75 and 80% of global emissions. Based on this, there was a historic milestone at COP28 held in Dubai in 2023. For the first time, countries agreed to consider transitioning away from fossil fuels as part of their plans to combat climate change.
However, that transition hasn't advanced much since then, right?
Exactly. The language used in COP28 agreements was historic, but there's been little progress since. Agreements at the following COPs, 29 and 30, barely mentioned the transition away from fossil fuels. The fight, so to speak, is that oil-producing countries aren't 100% ready to break away from fossil fuels. Saudi Arabia, for example, the world's second-largest oil producer, described the COP28 agreement as a menu a la carte. Their argument is that countries can choose which approach to use to combat climate change, and that transitioning away from fossil fuels would just be one option among many, literally like a restaurant menu.
But there is a group of countries that wants to put fossil fuels at the center of the discussion.
That's right, Camila. At COP30, for example, which was here in Brazil, maybe our listeners will remember, a group of more than 80 countries signed a declaration calling for the issue to be taken more seriously. Some countries even raised their voices, saying they wouldn't leave Brazil without a stronger agreement on fossil fuels. But as I said before, no language on fossil fuels made it into the COP30 agreements. So the alternative for these countries was to create their own parallel paths.
What do you mean by parallel paths?
Well, Camila, while the COP structure is obviously important because it brings together all countries in the world to talk about climate change.
Let me interrupt you right there. Almost all countries, right? The United States left the Paris Agreement some time ago and isn't participating in the COPs.
True, Camila. Let me reiterate. Almost all countries. While COPs gather nearly all countries to discuss climate change, progress there can sometimes be slow because the structure requires consensus. In other words, if just one country blocks any discussion about transitioning away from fossil fuels, others can't move forward. So parallel paths are being created outside this COP UN structure to discuss the issue. Let me highlight two. First, one from the COP30 presidency, who is creating a roadmap on the subject. Think of it as a manual for countries ready to transition. Again, it's not mandatory for all countries, but a reference for those who feel able to tackle this issue already.
And the other?
The other is a series of conferences with only those countries that want to talk about the transition. The first took place in April in Colombia with the Netherlands as co-host.
And you were at that conference in Santa Marta, right, Lucas? What was the goal?
That's right, I was there. Camila, since this conference wasn't a part of the formal UN structure, it couldn't really promise major binding agreements. The idea instead was to bring together like-minded countries to actually discuss transitioning away from fossil fuels without fear of being vetoed.
What can you tell us about attendance at this conference?
Well, Camila, about 60 countries attended. These countries account for 1/3 of global GDP, 1/5 of global oil production, and 1/3 of consumption.
That's quite a lot. And what came out of it?
Well, the attending countries agreed to create 3 work streams to begin transitioning away from fossil fuels. The first will help countries develop their own roadmaps for the transition and ensure these are aligned with each country's climate goals. These roadmaps must include strategies to eliminate emissions from fossil fuel exports.
And do any countries already have such a roadmap?
France and Colombia presented theirs during the conference. Brazil also says it's working on one, but there's no timeline for delivery. And let's not forget the COP30 roadmap.
And the other work streams?
Okay, the second will support countries in transforming their financial systems and unlocking investment flows needed for the transition. To explain, some countries there in Colombia said factors like fiscal responsibilities, debts to other countries, and subsidies that encourage fossil fuel consumption make it hard for them to even start transitioning. So this workstream aims to analyze these three elements in depth and find creative, innovative ways to overcome them.
And there's a third work stream that is quite interesting as well.
That's right, Camila. I personally find it very interesting. This third work stream will study countries' trade balances and promote progress towards fossil fuel trade systems. This means organizing, mapping, and addressing any trade that still generates emissions. Why do I think that's interesting? Because many countries show nice climate targets with low emissions, but in reality, they export huge amounts of fossil fuels, basically exporting their emissions. So the goal of this workstream is to map how some economies are still heavily reliant on fossil fuel exports and how they can shift to lower emission alternatives.
And what are the next steps for this conference?
Okay, so first, Colombia and the Netherlands will produce a report to be delivered to the COP30 presidency to help with its own roadmap. This should happen in June. Then, discussions will continue at a second conference to be held in Tuvalu, a Pacific island nation. Holding it there is symbolic because Tuvalu literally risks disappearing due to climate change. One point about the second conference, Camila. Tuvalu has already said it will revisit the strategy of who should attend. If countries that usually block discussions on transitioning away from fossil fuels weren't invited this time, Tuvalu might invite them. But that's for the future.
I'll take advantage of you mentioning the invited countries. Everything agreed in Colombia is interesting, but eventually these discussions will have to return to the COP negotiating table, right?
Yes, Camila, that's a great point. The COP structure continues to be very important. And let's remember, COP31 will take place in November this year in Turkey. The clash between countries focusing on emissions and those focusing on fossil fuels will definitely continue there. I would even say it will be one of the central issues of the conference. The COP31 presidency, though, recently announced its priorities for the conference. And guess what? Fossil fuels weren't even on the list.
And what is the significance of this?
Camila, that means that some countries are going to have to take the initiative to put the issue on the table. And so far, no one has. But there's still time. I even have information that the COP30 presidency wouldn't block an attempt to add it to the agenda. But let's wait and see. But if I had to guess, I would say it is very unlikely this issue won't come up at COP.
And why do you say that?
Because of the war in Iran, Camila, and the price shock that came with it. With disruptions in oil and gas supply, another issue enters the discussion: energy security. And that could accelerate consumers' transition away from fossil fuels even faster.
And that's affordability right there, right? And the world will have to find alternatives to fossil fuels. Here in Brazil, for example, the government is expected to bet on biofuels.
Oh, sure thing, Camila. Brazil is a powerhouse in biofuel production and consumption. The government has already signaled that it wants to quickly raise the ethanol blend in gasoline to 32%, not only to keep encouraging ethanol production, but also to mitigate rising fuel prices after the war began.
And here's the great opportunity for me to remind our listeners that Argus will host the Latin American Conference on Biofuels and Feedstocks here in São Paulo from June 15th to 17th. So back to you.
Yes, Camila, biofuels are right at the center of this climate debate and the transitioning away from fossil fuels. Latin America, without a doubt, will be a very relevant player in all of this. The region, including the Caribbean, is responsible for about 30% of the world's liquid biofuel production, according to ALADI, the Latin American and Caribbean Energy Organization. And this production needs to grow. The same ALADI says the biofuel production in the region will need to increase by more than 300% for it to reach carbon neutrality by 2050.
So, biofuels, energy transition, totally connected. Lucas, thank you for joining us here on the podcast, and thanks for listeners as well. Argus closely follows commodity movements in Brazil and around the world. Check out more episodes of our podcast on the main platforms or at argusmedia.com. See you next time.